anybody plays. Imagine W.G. Siebold, the author of Rings of Saturn and Austerlitz, as well as accounts of bombing campaigns conducted during the Second World War. Imagine that he came across this photograph in an English thrift store. In an interview about photography, Siebold mentioned that he often visited thrift stores in Norfolk and Suffolk and spent time sifting through boxes of discarded photos, and that's something I like to do myself. Some of the photos Siebold purchased on his thrift store visits are published in his books, along with snapshots that he took himself. Siebold had a sophisticated, if quirky, understanding of photography. He recognized that it was inextricably bound up with modernity, with modern life, and it was a phenomenon that inhabits every part of modern life. From birth to death, war to peace, art to advertising, theoretical physics to the manufacture of atomic bombs. And that's my list, not his. This is a photograph of the very first atomic bomb built. It was detonated at Alamogordo in the New Mexican desert on July 16th, 1945. So that is, it was called by the people putting it together, the Gadget. That was his code name. And this is a photograph of a cloud before it's a mushroom cloud, just 0.3 seconds after the detonation, which you can see written here, taken by Berlin Brixner, the very first atomic photographer. And you could say that the iconography of the bomb, the iconography of the mushroom cloud, began at 5:29 in the morning of July 16th, 1945. Siebold put great store in his subjective responses to photographs, as well as in the stories that emerged from them. Hypothetical thinking was his term for this phenomenon. So it's reasonable to ask how he might have responded to the image on the screen. Photographs of military officers in uniform are a dime a dozen in thrift stores, and Siebold might have skipped over it and continued to look through the box of loose photographs. Like so many genres of photograph, carte de visite, wedding pictures, snapshots of family reunions, photographs of posed military personnel are all the same and all different. For Siebold to have paused over the picture on the screen, something would have had to catch his eye. The raised garden tap on the left, perhaps, which is the kind of detail that led him to make literary detours in his novels. Siebold's literary detours, I should say for those of you who don't read him, are highly celebrated. And in this particular case, his disquisition might be on, say, looking at the tap on water rationing in English gardens during wartime, a very Sieboldиan kind of detour. Or perhaps the gap between the figure on the left and the two figures on the right would have caused him to pause. Or he might have noticed the variation in the Second World War uniforms worn by the officers, Royal Air Force on the left and Royal Canadian Air Force on the right. As a chronicler of war, Siebold would likely have known the difference. He would certainly have known that the photograph was not the work of an amateur. The sharp focus, the positioning of the camera with the sun behind it, the tight composition announces professional work. But Siebold would have had no way of determining the occasion for the photograph or the names of the officers represented. For the record, they are my father on the left, my uncle in the middle, and my grandfather on the right. My grandfather was one of the founders of the Royal Canadian Air Force. So if I was trying to compete with, which I don't want to do with Lindsay Freeman because her book is so wonderful, but if I had to find a sentence, mine might be, my grandfather helped form an Air Force, something of that kind. For Siebold, the absence of this information might have been the beginning of a story. As a narrator of capitalist accumulation and war, of gain, loss, and ruin, Siebold might have seen the gap in the picture as representing a missing person, someone no longer alive. The dark patch in the shrubbery behind the space where a figure might have stood reads like a shadow. Siebold might also have recalled a photograph discussed by Barthes in Camera Lucida, his mother as a young girl, standing in a winter garden, which is not reproduced in the book. Barthes deliberately left it out, though he returned to it time and again in his text. Barthes and Siebold were both emotionally susceptible to the stories that can arise from photographs, at the same time that they were conscious, acutely conscious, I should say, of the unreliability of those stories. Two more photographs of Air Force pilots. The one on the left was taken in 1940, shortly after the Battle of Britain, and the one on the right in 1945, a few days before the end of the Second World War. The two aircraft pictured are a Hawker Hurricane fighter plane and a B-29 bomber. And the primary weapons on board are a machine gun and an atomic bomb, respectively. The aircraft are piloted by Peter O'Brien, a Canadian, and Paul Tibbets, an American. They are on the same side of the conflict, one in the European theater of war, notwithstanding the insignia beneath saying China British. What that meant was that the plane had been bought by veterans who had served in China at some point. And apparently this was common on many fighter planes. And then the one on the right in the Pacific Theater. Both pilots had been given targets. The German Luftwaffe on the one hand, and the Japanese city of Hiroshima on the other. The difference between the targets and the weapons assigned to destroy them is the difference between one era and another, between the pre-nuclear era and the post-Hiroshima era. The industrial technologies of the pre-nuclear era could be more or less controlled, while the technologies enabling nuclear destruction cannot. Another photograph by Berlin Brixner of the Trinity Detonation. At the time of this detonation, scientists debated whether the explosion, marking the material transition from theoretical to applied physics, would ignite the atmosphere and destroy the world. For months, they had been concerned about ignition temperatures while doing their work out in the New Mexican desert. Enrico Fermi, who built the first nuclear reactor in a squash court at the University of Chicago, and who thought the risk of atmospheric ignition to be minimal, took bets from his fellow physicists that the chain reaction would not destroy the world. Pretty macabre. Barbara Norfleet, who's in Cambridge, Massachusetts, took this photograph of a bust of Oppenheimer in Los Alamos, in a museum at Los Alamos. On orders from Oppenheimer, the test went ahead, and the world changed in an instant, notwithstanding the intact survival of the atmosphere. At that moment, the negatives of technological advancement came to exceed any kind of measurable risk. Risk had turned into threat. The level of devastation produced by the atomic bomb demonstrated that the human species, for the first time, had the capability to destroy itself, to annihilate itself. This photograph by Norfleet transforms the scientist, transforms Oppenheimer, from a living figure into a metaphorical figure of pillar, not figure, a metaphorical pillar of salt in my metaphor, capped by his signature pork pie hat. Norfleet's camera freezes Oppenheimer against a black background, making him look as if he has just gazed upon the forbidden and paid a biblical price for his transgression. Her image underscores Oppenheimer's description of himself as a destroyer of worlds, a destroyer of worlds. Nuclear weapons make a target of everyone, and so do cameras. There is a terrible thing in every photograph, Bart wrote. It is the return of the dead. Individuals seen represented in photographs are not the same as they were when the photographs were taken. They are inevitably older and perhaps no longer alive. This photograph of me as an air cadet, taken on a parade ground 17 years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is no exception. At the time, the bombings barely registered in my consciousness, or so I remember. Oh, I'm sorry, did I not have that down before? Well, there it is. Good, we'll pass over it quickly. Photographs mark events, and nuclear photographs mark them vividly. Consider images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. One on the left is the destruction at Hiroshima. On the right, a photograph taken by Shomei Tomatsu in Nagasaki. Let me say it again. Consider images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Bikini Atoll and the Nevada test site, Chernobyl and Fukushima, Port Radium and Port Hope, Chalk River and Bruce Power. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are part of our collective memory, less because of the books written about the devastation that's occurred, less because of the books, or even because of the witness accounts provided by the Hibakusha, the survivors of the bomb, and this is one right here, than because of a visual archive of emblematic photographs like these two. The enriched uranium and plutonium in the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from ore mined at Port Radium in the Northwest Territories and refined in Port Hope, Ontario. Photographs exist of both sites. Richard Finney photographed an employee of Eldorado Mining and Refining, which owned the Port Radium mine, resting his hand on sacks of pitch blende concentrate rich in uranium. The image strikes the eye not only because of the subject matter, but also because of the repetitive pattern produced by the white labels on the sacks. Eldorado's refinery in Port Hope, Ontario, which opened in the early 1930s as a radium plant to start off with, is, and this is astonishing to many people when I tell them, the oldest extant nuclear facility in the world. For much of its existence, it produced uranium dioxide and uranium hexafluoride for shipment to the United States under military contract. The company was a pioneer in the secret as well as the material sides of the atom. The Port Hope factory is represented on a postcard from about 1950 that glows with unnatural blues and reds so intense they may well have been manufactured in an experimental corner of the plant. I should also say that I went to high school in Port Hope, and an unusually high percentage of the boys in my class, because it was a boys' school, have died of cancer. One of those was a quiet boy who went on to become Ronald Reagan's full-time photographer. I always loved that. Port Radium and Port Hope are both significant stops on the atomic highway. The highway is sometimes called the Yellow Cake Road for the bright yellow color of powdered uranium concentrate. Uranium is the indispensable element that fuels nuclear energy. It is the foundational ingredient in all nuclear weapons. In common with most of my generation, the so-called silent generation that came before the baby boom generation, I was personally caught up in nuclear events long before I started to research them in the early 2000s. When the threat of nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union heightened with the beginning of the Korean War in 1950, I was a first-grade student living just outside New York City doing duck and cover drills that sent me scrambling beneath my desk. In the mid-1950s, my family was living in Scotland on an air base equipped with aircraft capable of intercepting Soviet bombers armed with nuclear weapons. I can still remember the sound of the RAF jets taking off and landing. I could determine whether the planes were coming or going by the telltale pitch of their engines, like the tick-tock of the clock in the crocodile's stomach in Peter Pan. But I can't remember forming any idea of what those aircraft were for. My childhood brushes what you're looking at before as a Soviet aircraft, known as the Chu-95 Bear. It was like the B-52 bomber for the Soviet Union. And those were the planes that were also going to high staging grounds in the Arctic, ready to come down to Europe or to the United States. And which the RAF base, in which I was living at the edge of, was there to intercept. My childhood brushes with nuclear activities lay dormant for decades. Unlike the time traveler in Chris Marker's 1962 film, La Jetée, and there's a still from it, or the early obsessions of the cultural theorist Paul Virilio with bunker ruins, I wasn't haunted by recurring images of disaster. But if a lack in the past makes a claim on the present, then it was only a matter of time before the bomb caught up with me. The political theorist Hannah Arendt distinguished between her pre-nuclear generation and my generation in her book On Violence. The possibility of doomsday, she observed, was my generation's first decisive experience of the world. Those born during the Second World War, those who were alive during the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, are psychologically disposed to return to the sites of nuclear catastrophe. If Arendt is correct, I almost failed to make the return, as I said in the little synopsis of this talk. It took me more than half a century to get there or to get here. As an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, I studied economics, or more accurately, economic history, as I had little aptitude for mathematics and statistics, as real economists in this room will realize. David's around here somewhere. I also fell in with a bad crowd at university who were interested in art and literature and music and reading philosophy. And upon graduation, I might have, if I'd had the funds, opened a bookstore or an art gallery. But I didn't. So I went into investment banking. The photograph on the screen of a beaver pelt being used as a check made out to the Hudson's Bay Company is illustrated in Merchant Princes by Peter C. Newman. And I'm the figure on the right in the light suit. I don't think I wore it to stand out, but I might have done. Eventually, I left the world of finance and rejoined the world of artists and writers. I also went to graduate school in the United States to study the relationships between art and capital, as well as the relationships of art to the Cold War. And this ad promoting INCO, 1954, INCO came under heavy criticism, and in fact it was about to be broken up into pieces by the US Congress because it had a monopoly on aluminum, nickel and aluminum. So what it did was that this was just at the moment when Eisenhower began his Atoms for Peace ideas, which in fact was a deflection, a brilliant deflection, although it didn't work, to try and suggest that the United States, was a peaceful country and was producing medical isotopes that would help, more medical isotopes than it was enriched uranium for bombs. Not true. And so INCO is riding on the coattails of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace. And it worked. They survived. I arrived at graduate school in 1980, shortly before Ronald Reagan's election as president, a period marked by mass anti-nuclear protests against his Star Wars program. This is Nancy Burson's wonderful photograph. She was a researcher at MIT, and she found a way to do composite photographs that were sort of more efficient than just about anybody else. So this is 55% Reagan and 45% Brezhnev. Reagan's election also marked the beginning of the so-called culture wars in the United States. During the 1980s and 1990s, government funding to the arts was cut. What little there was of it was cut. And anything that threatened privileged identities or seemed to support the Soviet Union was attacked. I mean, these resonate as I was preparing this. The stakes were high, but not so high as today, I think. How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art by Serge Guilbeault was a major target during the culture wars, which means that Serge in the book must have got it right. I was a minor target. I published a book for Harvard on collecting Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings, an innocuous subject you would have thought. But when the university applied to the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA, for publishing assistance, the application was rejected on the grounds that the book was Marxist. I had referred several times in the text to the bourgeoisie and to collector classes. The university was told, and I've still got the letter, was told that it should be ashamed of itself for aiding and abetting the politicization of art. Bruce Conner's Bombhead. A series of books I edited in the 1980s figured more prominently in the culture wars. The series brought together the essays and criticism of Clement Greenberg, the most influential and controversial art critic of the time. Early in his career, Greenberg had argued that the responsibility of the avant-garde was to maintain cultural standards in the face of fascism and the vicariousness of everyday life under capitalism. Confronted by these threats, art needed to be autonomous. It was not an atomic bomb, Greenberg famously remarked, though Bruce Conner proves him wrong in this photo collage. Greenberg also remarked that the avant-garde was tied to the bourgeoisie, and this is one of his most remarkable sentences, by an umbilical cord of gold. In order to produce paintings or literature, in other words, artists needed patronage. The Trotskyism exhibited by Greenberg at the beginning of his career in the 1930s gave way by the early 1950s to support for the Pax Americana and a liberal cast of mind. I argued that this shift in his politics was reflected in his art criticism. Soon after, my mother phoned to ask why they were saying such terrible things about me in Newsweek. and colleagues phoned to ask about an editorial written against me in the New Criterion, the intellectual organ of Reaganism. My approach to photographs is less subjective than Siebold's and Barth's. Although I have an emotional response to photographs, to the way they can unexpectedly strike you, what Barth calls the punctum, I tend to give precedence to more objective kinds of responses. When doing research on the nuclear, I will ask of a photograph, what does this tell me? What does it tell me that large numbers of cameras are photographing a mushroom cloud? What does it tell me that troops facing away from a blast have been placed so close to it? The answer in both cases, in this particular case, these were atomic foot soldiers. These were atomic soldiers who were being treated as guinea pigs to see how close you could get before you died. I kid you not. And Canada was a participant in that. 700 Canadian troops operated in the various tests that the United States conducted either in the continental United States or in the Pacific. Operation, not Desert Storm, Desert Rock. So you'll notice that Peter Sellers, as Dr. Strangelove, is holding a slide rule here. And the slide rule is to calculate the number of megadeaths that will occur in an all-out nuclear war. In his nightmare satire, we're at the end, almost at the end, perfect timing, so I can slow down and speak more extemporaneously. In his nightmare satire, Stanley Kubrick was completely unsentimental. He's often called an anti-war artist. He wasn't an anti-war artist or an anti-war director. I mean, half his films were around war, Full Metal Jacket, and many others. But these weren't films about right and wrong. These were films that were talking about how war works. What's the logic and illogic of it? What is the anatomy of it? This is a vehicle called Seabiscuit. Photography has the capacity to shape and reshape perceptions of the nuclear enterprise by revealing hidden activities and risks. I am not suggesting that by throwing light on what has been obscured, by revealing the disfigurements in modern life since the development of the atomic bomb, that photography can repair what has been misshapen. It can't. Heavy water used to moderate nuclear fission was manufactured here in BC in the 1940s in the West Kootenay by Consolidated by Cominco. And the purpose of the heavy water was to build bombs. The water was to go both to the United States and back to Chalk River, where a heavy water reactor was being built. I've had arguments with this about so many people who say that Chalk River is so wonderful, it's making all sorts of medical licenses. True, but it started off as a bomb factory as part of the Manhattan Project. There were 3 members of the Manhattan Project, Britain, Canada, and the United States, and the only the nuclear reactor at Chalk River went online, went critical at the very moment that the war ended. But its purpose was to build bombs. And so here you've got Seabiscuit, which had 4 machine guns on board. It looks like it was built in the Prohibition era. But there were 4 machine guns on there, as well as half a dozen men with rifles. And it was there to protect the heavy water plant in Trail, BC. Bringing to light this footnote in nuclear history can't mend it what was damaged in the production of the heavy water or the atomic bombs. Nor do I want to suggest that photography can operate outside history and nuclear events. It can't. Photography, like the bomb itself, is an agent of history. It's a participant in history. And my final comment with my final slide, which is this rapatronic photograph taken by Doc Edgerton, also MIT, Harold Edgerton, who invented a camera that could take 1,000 images per second. And by the end, I think even more than that, through a complicated system of mirrors. And this particular photograph taken by him, or under his direction, shows an atomic bomb on a 300-foot, or the beginning of an atomic detonation, the gases, but at a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second, just the very, very, very short time period. And you see the tower and the guy wires coming down holding the tower up, which of course is going to be completely destroyed by the explosion. So, this is, I think, Upshot and Knothole. Upshot and Knothole, they all had names. Shasta, Daisy, Upshot, Knothole, Plum Bob. Upshot and Knothole's got to be one of the most peculiar. And I don't know why they got these names. It's something I've got to find out. Who gave them the names and why? Thank you. So to build more powerful weapons like this 1953 shot, to build more powerful weapons, the United States and other nuclear countries developed faster cameras that aided in the scientific measurement of blast yields. So that's what this camera does. It lets you know what the blast yield is for those who really know how these things work. So better cameras led to better photographs, and better photographs led to better bombs, bigger bombs. Still, photography continues to haunt the nuclear imaginary, certainly haunts my nuclear imaginary, and a lot of you know what I spent a lot of time talking about, that I have become haunted by it, fixated on it. And it often has the ability to disclose what has been obscured, even though it can't mend things. Like radioactive fallout, it circulates everywhere, turning up in places you least expect it, including this room. Thank you.